conference. Our today's subject is Application Lifecycle Management. As usual, we will have 2 sessions today. First, Gary will talk and then Nigel. And sessions will be about 45 minutes long, and then we'll have Q&A sessions after them, and we will have a short break right before the second session. So just to start,
So Carol, just a note on Q&A. If people have any questions, if they can post them to the chat window and leave it, send them to all participants.
Yes, please
then they'll be visible to everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Please send it to all participants, not to host or panelists only, because then not everyone can see it. Correct. So Gary, I gave you presenter rights.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my monitor.
Yes.
Just move this bar out of the way. Okay, so as Carolee mentioned there, today's theme is Application Lifecycle Management, or ALM. What I'm going to start today's session on is talking about Debugger, which is a key aspect of the development lifecycle. So making better use of Debugger and understanding the features of it hopefully will help that play with inside that application lifecycle management from a development standpoint. If you weren't with us yesterday, I'll introduce myself. My name's Gary Taylor. I'm a system architect here with inside Unisys, working with the AB Suite product, and prior to that with Link and then EAE. So I have been working with the product for many years, including many years working with AB Suite. Okay, so I shall move on. So what I'm going to talk about, all right, there we go, is I'm going to look at a number of recent changes to the debugger environment and how that will affect or potentially affect how you use the product. A few useful features, or features that probably I find useful, maybe not everyone will, but I find them useful. A little bit about manipulating data. I've just noticed that somebody sent a message saying that the sending something or in the chat window to all participants is grayed out. I don't know if somebody can actually have a look at that, but I just saw that pop up anyway. I'll also talk a little bit about how you can make Debugger mimic your runtime more, so things like using external libraries and UIs, and also the ATT tool, which is the testing tool, and a little bit about performance and how you might be able to improve performance of Debugger. So before we start all of that, let's do a little bit of background about what Debugger is inside AB Suite. So as I've said there, as the first bullet point, it's built into Visual Studio. Unlike using Debugger with EAE, where it was a separate toolset, with Debugger, it's built into the Visual Studio environment where you do development. So if you want to initiate debugging, you literally just have to click on, well, it actually, this is a screenshot showing me actually running Debugger, but let me just get the pen. But there's a bit here, it says continue, but the main thing is this little green thing here is the start button, and you click on that and that will start debugging. So we built it into the product. It makes it a lot easier to use, and it uses and is part of the standard Visual Studio environment. So it's no real different to anybody else or any other debugger. So if you were familiar with Visual Studio and have done debugging with C#, VB.NET, something like that, then it will be a similar look and feel to that. The other aspect of debugging is that it's a virtual runtime, and that virtual runtime environment shares much with the AB Suite runtime environment. So we utilize many of the same tools. So we have an administration client that we use for administering the Windows runtime. We can use that, well, it's not a case of can, we need to use that as part of setting up our debugging environment. And we'd also use that for setting up logging or rattle. So this is a screenshot showing you what the administration client looks like, showing you in this particular case, I've got a mixture of runtime systems and there's a debug system down here as well. And if I want to set up, I do that through the same tool, and the same if I want to set up rattle, which I'll talk about a little bit later. If I want to use my own UI, you use the same tools to do that. The other aspect of it is that it uses the same WinForm client as the you would potentially use on the Windows runtime environment. It has the same database structure, so we go through the same reorg process. Some of the security concepts share the same aspects of it as well. So there's a lot of stuff here that is shared with the Windows runtime. But it is also different. The AB Suite on Windows runtime is now a 64-bit product, but Debugger, because it uses Visual Studio, and Visual Studio is a 32-bit environment, is a 32-bit setup. Now what this means is that if you want to and decide to look, you'll actually see underneath component services there are what's called Compass applications, and there's a bunch of those that have got 32-bit in the title, and they're all the ones to do with Debugger, and then there was a whole bunch of them to do with Windows runtime. But you'll see here we've got one called Database Manager here, and we've got another one here. A lot of the same infrastructure. So the way it works and so on is similar to Windows runtime, but not exactly the same. The other thing to be aware of is that the debugger is written in C++, not in .NET. So it doesn't do everything the same as the Windows runtime. It's an emulated environment. Engineering have done, I think, a very good job to emulate the two platforms currently, and will obviously do the same for the OS 2200 platform when we get to 8.0. But it is a separate environment to Windows runtime. It's interpreted, similar to it was in developer test in EAE. But one of the things that you will see as part of Debugger when you start it up, and that is it builds what's called wrappers. And these wrappers are there to intercept calls from essentially from the UIs. So by default, we would use the WinForm client to display anything. And the way the wrappers work is the WinForm client tries to talk to a Windows runtime system, but instead those calls are intercepted by the wrappers and redirected to Debugger. So that's the reason for these. And these wrappers are only built the first time they're needed or a significant change is made. Significant change would be you add a new iSpec, add a new report, but other than that, they only need to be built once. But they do take a little bit of time, and that's one of the things we'll talk about when I get to performance. So we'll move on and we'll look at some of the recent changes. Now, some of these changes are based around the fact that the debugger environment is essentially a runtime that's based upon the Windows runtime or shares a lot of commonality with the Windows runtime. And that means it's very different to what people potentially were used to when they were using the AE. And because of that, often that difference, and this is something that anybody who's been on any training that I've delivered for AB Suite will hear me say a lot. The difference, it's not because the product is difficult, it's just that it's different. And when you first presented with something that's very different, it can seem difficult to use. But engineering have taken on board that the ability or the time it takes to learn and understand how to set up that debugger environment can be a little bit time consuming and can be a little bit daunting. So they've tried in one of the new features of 7.0 to improve that. And what they've done is given us a quick start debugging capability. And essentially what this does is it will populate the minimum values that are needed automatically for you. So anybody who's familiar with using Debugger will probably understand these, but there are some key fields that you need to put in. So schema name. Schema is the essentially the owner of the tables. So Debugger runs against or creates a debugger database that exists within SQL Server, and schema name is the user ID that owns those tables. Alternate name is effectively your AB Suite system name. So when you look inside the admin tool, you would see that particular name specified. The other thing about alternate name is it has to be unique on the actual machine. Database name, well, that's the name of your SQL Server database that you are going to use for debugging purposes. And what they've done with the Quick Start debugging is, as you can see here with this screenshot, you've got the ability to define a prefix, and that prefix is then appended to the schema name, the alternate name, and the database name. In the case of the database, they also add DB on the end of it. And because you have to create a database before you can use it, previously in earlier versions, you'd have to go in there and go through using what's called the administration client for the Windows runtime and create that database up front. Now, as part of one of these changes, you don't need to do that. It will automatically create it for you. You don't need to set all of these options up. It does it for you. You can still create those values if you want to. So you can still specify your own database here, your own alternate name, and so on. So it's perfectly valid to do it. The way it works is if you change this value, these are updated. If you change these values, then essentially you override that automatic updating. It has changed through the life of 7 with the ICs, so it doesn't quite work that way in the version you're running. That's probably because you're not running the latest IC. Does still require some work to be done externally, but it's much easier now. You haven't got to set everything up. And as I say, you can still configure things manually if you want to. So moving on to some further changes. The other thing in a similar vein is now debug is selected essentially in the class view. So if you want to debug the system, the segment, then you select the segment. If you want to debug a report, you go to the report, right-click on it and say debug. And the same if you've got a public segment method. You can do all of those by just right-clicking on them. So as you can see here, PerformDB is my segment name. I right-click on it, I see the word debug there. And once I click on that, I then get the option either to step into, which is how it used to work in EAE, sorry, not in EAE, how it used to work in prior versions of AB Suite. And effectively that will stop at the first line of logic in your application. So if you try and debug the segment, then the first line of logic for any runtime system is the first line startup logic. So if you debug a segment, it will go to the first line of startup logic and stop. And that's the behavior you had prior to 7.0. Now in 7.0, that's the alternate behavior, and you can get to that by pressing F11. Pressing the start button or F5, which is the normal way of starting debugger, now will continue until you find the first breakpoint. So again, it means it's not so much it speeds it up, it just takes out a step in the process. You don't need to remember to wait for that screen to come up and then say continue. It will now continue until you get to the first breakpoint that you've defined. So again, they've just made it a little bit easier. The other aspect of this change is that what that effectively means is that Debugger now runs based upon the action rather than the configuration setting. So in prior versions of Debugger from 7.0, what you would do is you create a configuration, which is, for those coming from EAE, like similar to a generate step. And in there, you would mark that particular configuration as for this particular environment to be debugging or debugger. And you turn debugger on. So essentially, there was a debugger mode. And that would allow you to say, I want to debug the system, or the segment, I should say, or a report, or you want to use an external tool to interface to it. That's no longer the case. Now we've got the ability to build or debug from the same configuration. And the great thing with this is that it means that you don't need to keep those separate configurations. Having multiple configurations isn't a huge problem, but you do need to potentially keep them in step. Now we don't need that extra one, and it's much easier to do it. So you don't have to get rid of them, but you could get rid of them if you so choose. So again, just showing you what this means is if I right-click on the deployment folder here at the top, I've got the build option, and I've also got debug. So if I take the build, it will go and build the system as though it's building it to that particular runtime platform. And if I click on debug, it will debug it again based upon the platform settings. It will go off and start debugging that particular system. Now, I've mentioned on the very first bit the sort of the background stuff. There's these wrappers that are built. In prior versions, they were automatically built for you, but you also had the ability to build them manually. That essentially goes away, but they're still automatically built for you as required. In most cases, you wouldn't need to rebuild them. There was some special cases, and there are ways around that today if you have to, mainly using yet another tool. There's a debug administration tool you can use. Another recent change is the introduction of the intermediate window. And what the intermediate window allows you to do is evaluate expressions. So what this would essentially allow you to do is a couple of simple examples. If you've got a compute statement or the equivalent of a compute statement that's doing a calculation or something, you can just put that into the immediate window and it will show you the result. If you've got something that's creating a string, one of the things that Andy showed you on Tuesday was to use the attach and space short forms, which is the ampersand and the ampersand plus, to create a string on the fly. So you didn't have to do move something and then attach something and attach something. You can do all of that in one command. If you put that one command into the immediate window, then you'll get the result from it. So if you want to see how's this going to look when I display a message, I'll put it into the immediate window. It will show you. And then you can go back and edit your code if you want to from there onwards. You can also use the immediate window to update values. So I've got a very simple example here on the screen showing you cust.account month is assigned a value of 10, but that I don't have to make it just a simple literal. I can actually make that a calculation. So if you want to update a value based upon a calculation, you can put that into the immediate window as well. I've called it, and I've just realized what I've put on the screen here. It's actually the immediate window, not the intermediate window. I can't blame that on predictive text, but that's a mistake on my part. I do apologize. Okay. The other thing you can do with the immediate window is you can print values via the debug.print command. And there is a short form of that, just a question mark. So question mark value to convert, which is a variable or an attribute that I've got defined, and it's showing me that's currently set to essentially the number 3. So it's very easy to use this window in lots of different ways, and it's quite a powerful capability. Another big change really in Visual Studio, and something that's come about at the request of our clients. We've had feedback from a number of clients about this. So this change is that in prior releases, what would happen if you initiated through Debugger, you were using the online, and through Debugger you then initiated a report. That report would have fired up a second copy of Visual Studio. You would then go into that second copy of Visual Studio and debug the report there. It would automatically put you into Debugger in that second instance. But anybody who's used Visual Studio knows that Visual Studio takes a little while to come up. It's a very large product. So, you know, forget AB Suite, just bringing up Visual Studio can take quite a while. And so one of the things that we've done with 7.0 is instead of initiating another Visual Studio session, we start the report within the same session. Essentially, it runs as a separate thread or process inside the same Visual Studio session. And this delay of starting reports is a feature that a number of clients had requested, said, can we improve things? And this is the result of those requests. We've put that into the product now in 7.0. So a little bit off topic, but if you have any requests you'd like the product to be able to do, or any features you'd potentially like in the product, please raise that with us as a new feature suggestion. You raise a support call, and in that support call, say, I'd like this particular feature as a new feature suggestion. I'm not going to say we will implement it, but engineering do take notice of those requests, and based upon those requests that come in and other factors, they will get considered. And I say it may not be in the next product, it may be the product release after that, but the point with it is if you make those requests of us, we will listen and potentially will implement them. So this is an example of where we have done that. Another change that's been put in recently is to do with the call stack window. And this shows you if you've got a method that calls another method, or a global logic calls another global logic, which calls another global logic, that will create a stack of calls. Previously, that just showed you the stack. Now what we also do in that stack is we show you the parameters that have been passed, if there are any. So in this particular case, I can see that value to convert was passed into glp_make ALP. Stands for Global Logic Performable Make Alpha, but it's one of my own routines. But in here, this routine here, value to convert, is a number, and it's been defined with a direction of in out. The other great thing is if you double click on the line in question, so if I double click on this line, it will take me to that line of logic, or if I can come down here, I can double click on any of the other lines and it will take me to that line of logic, essentially where it is in the stack. And that allows you to easily navigate around, potentially change things, because that's one of the other big changes compared to EAE at least, is you've got the ability to edit logic and continue. So it allows you to make the changes and continue debugging without having to exit and come back in again. Now I've got a couple of useful features slides. Let's say these are features I find useful. First of these is breakpoints. Now the main one here really is about breakpoint windows. There's an option that allows you under View You go to View, Debug, and then there's Breakpoints. And that will allow you to view all of the breakpoints you've got defined within your solution. And one of the challenges I've had is I've put breakpoints if I'm trying to get to the bottom of quite a difficult problem. I may put breakpoints all over the place. And then when you start running it again and you think you've fixed everything, all of a sudden it stops because it's hit a breakpoint. So using the breakpoint window allows you to see all the ones that you've got. You can disable them, re-enable them if you need to, just by checking or unchecking the tick next to each one. The other great thing about it is double-click on a line, it will take you to that breakpoint. A further aspect of breakpoints is something that's not introduced as part of 7, but reasonably recently, and that's conditional breakpoints. And conditional breakpoints allow you, by just right-clicking on the breakpoint itself, to specify a condition. And that condition can then be either to just allow it to break on when you reach that line, so that's the standard breakpoint, essentially, or hit count. And what hit count will do is essentially says, if you hit this line 100 times, for example, then break. Or you can put a conditional. When you use conditional, you just specify standard LDL plus type conditions, the thing that you'd put into a do when or an if statement. You will notice, as the screenshot shows here, it says e.g. x equals 5. That syntax there is actually C# syntax. Don't use that, that will not work. You use standard LDL plus syntax. So anything that you would be able to put into a do when or an if statement, you can put in there. And it doesn't have to be just a single condition, it can be multiple conditions as long as it's syntactically correct. So, you know, using brackets, you can and or conditions together. You don't have to halt. You can do something else if you want to. So as you can see here, there's an option to continue executing. You can log messages to an output window, so you can essentially put some messages out when you get to this particular one. So you don't have to actually stop execution at a conditional breakpoint. You can actually use it for other purposes. So there's quite a lot of functionality here, and anybody who's used Visual Studio for other languages will see that this is pretty much the same capabilities you've got there. So that's something else that's actually been happening over the last few releases with AB Suite. We're beginning to make more and more use of standard Visual Studio functionality. The editor was a big change in 6.1, for example, that's allowed us to use a lot more of the Visual Studio functionality. So conditional breakpoints is quite a useful feature. And as I say, you know, you don't have to even break, so you know you can use it in different ways. Another useful feature is the log verb. It's a new LDL plus verb, and what it allows you to do is to actually write logic and to cause messages to be output to the debugger output window. If you've got a Windows runtime environment, you can also use the same command to write to the Windows runtime system log. And the syntax of it is log, and then you can sort of say whether you want to use it in debug, release, or always. So in other words, you're just saying when should it be used. You've got essentially some indicators here as to what type of error should it detect, and then you just have an expression, something it's going to print effectively, and you've got the ability to define 1 or 2 expressions in there. If you're using this on in Debugger and deploying to the MCP environment, then it's a no operation on MCP. It doesn't actually cause anything to get generated, so it won't affect the MCP runtime. but so it does allow you to leave that command in there. You don't have to worry about it if you're targeting both Windows and MCP, or if you're just wanting to use it for debugger purposes, it's quite fine to do that. Okay. Another useful feature, and again, this is also a recent change. It's something that's been changing since about 5.0. We've put a number of patches in, and the feature's been slowly being enhanced between 5 and 7. And that's the ability to monitor individual elements in an array. So originally what we used to do is take the array and try and convert it to a string. And essentially in this case, array example is our array, and it would have put or tried to put into the value a string version of the array contents. The problem we found with that is that doing that for very large arrays was quite a big impact on performance. So one of the things they've done now is we no longer convert it to a string. If you want to see the individual elements, you have to expand the array. And as I've done here, I've expanded the array, and I've got the array is defined using a group as a template. And that group has got a number of items in it, and then a subgroup. And you can see the contents of them. And if I expanded 2, you'd be able to see the contents of the array index 2. You've also got the ability to individually see an array element. So you don't have to go down that list. And this particular array has got 1,000 elements in it. So I wouldn't have wanted to scroll down to find one right near the end. So an alternative is you can use an expression to derive the index value. So the way you use arrays in AB Suite is you put the indices inside square brackets. So as you can see here, I've said that the indices I want to use is count1, which is a variable, minus 5. So in this case, count1 is currently set to 1,000. So I'm essentially looking for element 995. And that's what it's now displaying. So you can see it's still displaying the same fields as I did before, but this time it's just for one element. So this is, again, another change, and doing it this way, means you can copy logic effectively that creates the index into the element value. But it also means from a performance point of view, you don't have to show everything else, so it's much quicker. You can still, if you want to, see the whole string, but if you want to see the whole string, you now need to use the immediate window. So you would just put in here, as I've done here, array example, and then it's broken out that array and it's shown to me as a string. And if you actually did this, particularly with this one, because I purposely created an array that was quite large, it takes a few seconds to display that. So you'll get the impression, you'll understand now why I say it had a big impact on performance. So we don't need to display it all the time, so we give you the ability if you want to, but for most cases, you can just go in and look at the individual elements. So I'm now going to move on and talk a little bit about manipulating the data. And when I'm talking about data, I'm talking about the SQL Server database that is built for us for use with Debugger. So with EAE, we used to use the ISAM-based database that was quite difficult to get at because there wasn't tools supplied to access that data other than logic that you wrote yourself. But with AB Suite, we create a SQL Server database. So it's a standard SQL Server database, and it means we can use more of the standard SQL Server database type tools to access and manipulate that data. Now, something to be aware of with the database that's created is that when you define your application inside AB Suite and you want to do anything with that, there is this thing called configurations, and configurations are like generate sets in EAE, and like generate sets in EAE, you have a target platform associated with them. That target platform in 7 can be either MCP or Windows, and obviously will include 2200 when we get to 8. But if you're using MCP as the target platform, what that effectively means is we will create the database data and all the extract files in EBCDIC, because that's the collating sequence used on MCP platform. What that means is data is then returned in the same order. So if you're not aware of this, the collating sequence for EBCDIC has numbers after alpha. So you can write something along the lines of do when field greater than all 9s, because that essentially is a higher value than would be than any alpha numeric values. But if you did that on Windows, and the Windows uses ASCII to store the data, then ASCII numbers come before alpha, and so you wouldn't get any alpha fields. So it does mean that if you want to simulate that behavior and you've got that behavior in your code, you do need to have the code in EBCDIC to give you that right collating sequence. The problem with that is if you try and use the standard SQL Server management tools, the data is unintelligible. So to get around it, we supply a tool called the EBCDIC tool, and that allows you to view, as you can see here on the right-hand side, it gives you an example. You can use SQL-like syntax to query data, and you can also manipulate the data through the same tool. As I said, if you're using MCP as the platform, your extract files are also in EBCDIC. So again, if you can't use standard editing tools against those. So the EBCDIC tool has the ability to open and manipulate extract files as well. As I say, the tool set itself does allow you to update records, but it doesn't allow you to bulk load them. So getting data into the database in EBCDIC format may still be a bit of a challenge. For the other platforms, and even if you have got MCP as your final target, you may choose to set the platform to Windows for debugging purposes, would mean the data is then stored in ASCII format. And ASCII format is the format that you would normally expect inside the SQL database. And this allows you then to manipulate that data using standard SQL Server tools, the most likely one being what's called SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS. If you want to populate your database with data, well, the first thing to be aware of is if you're using Windows, well, it doesn't really matter actually which platform you're using. Regardless of your platform, the structure of the database schema, matches the Windows runtime environment. So if you have got a Windows runtime environment, that's very easy to just clone and use that data if you want to for debugging purposes. It's also in the way that you can use host database access when you've got a target platform with MCP to talk back to the MCP host and the DNS2 database. It's also the way you do it essentially with Windows runtime. So if you've got a Windows runtime, because the Windows runtime database and the debugger database are identical, you can just point your debugger session at your Windows runtime database and use it as you would do any other debug database. And when you're using a database that's in ASCII, then you can use the SQL Server Management Studio types tools and just use simple SQL statements to populate data. However, and the big difference here is that the Windows runtime database, i.e. the one that's used by Debugger, the schema definition of that is different to what you'll see on MCP. Not the business data, but the naming conventions that are used inside that database. So an example being, if you've got a table called cust in EAE that you move to AB Suite, when you build that to Debugger database for the Windows platform, you'll end up with a table called uppercase cust. On MCP, the set will be called lowercase cust. So there's a different naming convention. And that different naming convention will potentially have an impact. So it's not as straightforward as just saying, well, I'll use one of the tools, something like data exchange, to pull that data from MCP onto Windows. That data will then need to probably be converted in some way to the right naming conventions. There's also a whole bunch of indexes that are created on the tables, and they are created in a special way. So it's very unlikely you'll be able to use a database that you've created through other tools, as I say, something like data exchange, for use with Debugger. You'd have to move the data out of that initial database into the Debugger database. The other issue you potentially will have there is if you want to use Epsidic because you want that collating sequence, you're going to need to convert that data essentially back into Epsidic. So there are some challenges there if you want to really emulate your MCP environment or populate it from MCP. There are other ways of doing it. You can pull data out of DMS2 relatively easy. There's an OLADB type access layer, and you can map data, or you can write SQL statements that will read it out of MCP and write it to your Debugger database if you so choose. As an alternative to that, we've developed a tool here in the UK called the Ssis Generator. And what this tool is designed to help with is the transfer of data between different source and target platforms. And when I talk about source and target, I talk about EAE or AB Suite source and target. So it's specifically tailored to cope with the fact and understands the differences of naming conventions of EAE and AB Suite databases that have been created on those different platforms. And the tool itself allows us to essentially take data from one platform to another, and the source can be any of these shown down here, so SQL Server, MCP, Oracle, 2200, even EAE Developer Test, and we can transfer any of those to any of the targets. So SQL Server, including the option of making it Epsidic. We've got the option of going to MCP, so we can go from SQL Server to MCP, we can go from 2200 to MCP, we can go to EAE Developer Test. There's some restrictions on that, but in general we can do that, so it allows you to move data around pretty much any way you like, even to flat file CSV type files if you want to. Now, as I say, what this tool does is it generates what's called SSIS packages. SSIS is a standard SQL Server feature called SQL Server Integration Services. And what that allows you to do, it's a tool set that's designed to manipulate data and allow you to take any source or lots of different sources, manipulate the data in some way, transform it in some way, and then write it to a target output medium. And it doesn't have to be anything to do with SQL Server. The tool itself runs in SQL Server, but the source and the target doesn't have to be. So as you can see here, potentially I can use it to go from MCP to MCP. SQL Server's not in the equation there, other than that's where the tool runs. If you want to know a little bit more about this tool, we put together an article that was in the July 2019 Developing Agility. There's a link there on the slides, which when we make those available, you'll be able to use. Just a little bit more detail about the tool itself. The tool, as I say, is a generator to build these packages. The packages that it builds are standard SSIS packages. There is a Visual Studio plugin called SQL Data Tools that you use to create or edit these packages. So once they've been created using the tool, you can edit them if you want to. There's essentially one table per package. The packages are called these .dtsx files. And the other great thing with SSIS is that if the source or the transforms that you want to use don't exist, there's the ability to create your own custom versions of it. So as you saw on the previous slide, there was EAE Developer Test. Well, SQL Server doesn't know anything about EAE Developer Test, but we've been able to create our own custom transforms to do that. One of the other things we've recently added to the toolset is the ability to filter rows. Now, what we do with this is essentially using some simple rules, we can sort of say, we can limit effectively the rows that are sent to the target database. So here's an example of the rule. I've got sub-account number as the field in the structure. I'm using a verb here called substring. So what I'm saying is I want to take, starting at position 1, 4, 5, the characters out of sub-account number. And if those characters equals A1, 2, 3, 4, then I'll allow that row to go through to the destination. And the implications of that are shown here. So we start with our source, and that could be any source. So it could be MCP, it could be EAE Developer Test, 2200, doesn't matter what it is. We will put it through our filter, and we read 4,727 rows from our source, but only 954 of them matched the filter that I've got defined here. And that filter can be, as I've shown there, a sort of, something equal to literal. It can be a value in a file, a combination of things. And as I say, it's something, because we've built this filter component, we could potentially extend it if somebody was interested. So an example may be that somebody wants to do something that would obfuscate the data or something. So we could potentially use the same sort of thing to do that. We haven't got that capability, but if somebody's interested, come and talk to us, and maybe we can put that together and give you that capability. So there's quite a lot we can do with it. As I say, here we take the 472, we filter it down to 954, and that's what we write to the destination. So, it's a good way of creating a cut down database. We don't have the full size data, we only need a limited number of rows. Now, as I say, it creates packages. Those packages do not themselves get run. So the tool, it's a two-stage process. You run the tool, the generator, and that creates the packages. To actually move the data, you then need to execute those packages. So you can do that manually, and you can just do that by essentially double-clicking on the package or going into SQL Server. There's tools in there to allow you to sort of select them and say, I want you to go and run these. Or we've developed a script, and one of the great things about the script is that it will try and keep a constant number of packages running, and we found that's the best way to transfer large volumes of data. So we've used this both for clients in terms of Debugger, which is what we're talking about today, but we've also used it for people to move data, and in some cases, huge amounts of data as well, if necessary. So there's lots of different options here. We've got the potential, to maybe pull it from something you've already got on the Windows platform and maybe put it into a format that works for you for Debugger. That may be an option. So you use data exchange to get it from MCP to Windows, and then we use something like this to pull it out of that data exchange database and put it into your debugger database, potentially even then filtering the number of rows to create a cut down database. So there's some potential useful options there if anybody's interested. So if you are, do let us know, and we'll see what we can do and talk to you about it. Another aspect of using Debugger is how to get it to mimic your runtime environment. And what I really mean by this is, make it behave like your runtime does. So I talked yesterday about using external libraries. Well, if you use those external libraries, then chances are you're going to want to be able to debug using them. So if you're on the MCP host, where your libraries, you're running Debugger on Windows, but your libraries are on MCP. So we put a feature in place. It's been there a long time. It was in EAE as well, called LRSS. And this allows you to essentially call out to your MCP libraries in the same way as if you were running in the runtime environment. You've also got the ability to access libraries at a Windows level. So if you don't enable LRSS, then it will essentially go to the Windows platform and try and run the library that you've got defined locally on Windows. And again, this is how it used to work in EAE. The big difference here is that we've given you the ability to call more library types than you had previously. So you've now got the full gambit of libraries that you can call on the Windows platform as though you were running the Windows runtime. So .NET libraries, which you couldn't do with EAE, for example. Now, if you are going to call .NET libraries, you do need to be aware of some things. And the big thing here is that the implementation is slightly different to how it is used in the Windows runtime. Big difference is that Debugger is 32-bit. The runtime environment is 64-bit. The other aspect of it is Windows runtime uses .NET. Debugger is C++. So C++ is accessing these libraries via COM, not via COM+, which is how the Windows runtime works. Because of that, you do need to make sure you register the libraries. So that has some connotations about if you develop the library in one place on one machine and want to run it somewhere else, you need to make sure when you put it on the other machine, you need to register it. It's not just a case of copying it into a particular folder. It's not difficult. You just need to be aware of it. Another aspect of it is if you're running the libraries in Debugger, you may want those libraries to be able to work out that you are in Debugger because they may need to do something different because of the differences between the runtime platforms, for example, maybe for other reasons. And that's very easy to do. Here's a very simple example. Anybody who knows me knows that I don't deal with C#, so I only work with VB.NET, but here's a VB.NET line to do it, but I'm sure anybody could work out to do exactly the same using C#. And essentially, we're just looking to say that if the thing that is running me contains the word debugger, then I'm in debug mode. And the thing that runs all of this is something called SM Debugger, so System Modeler Debugger. So you will see a process running called SM Debugger. Few other things you need to be aware of if you're running .NET libraries is that there is no application folder as that you would have if you were running in the Windows runtime. Essentially, everything runs from the developer bin folder. If you want to create parameters and that, then there is no defined local place for those for Debugger to run from. So for each individual developer. So one of the things we've done for some of the libraries we've created for clients is we've invented essentially a local folder. The one we used was home drive, home path, SM Debugger. So %home drive, %home path are two variables that are defined on a Windows platform, so we don't need to know where they are. We just know they're be unique for each individual developer. And having that folder then allows us to put our parameter files there, and potentially we can define what our debugger system is. And our debugger system is identified by that alternate name, and that alternate name that I mentioned right at the beginning has to be unique on the machine. There is also a whole bunch of COM+ services that run on the machine when you're running AB Suite development or AB Suite Windows Runtime. And if you use those, you can call those through your libraries and get information. So if you know what the system name is. So, you know, there's this capability, but it's things that you just need to be aware of. And say that probably this is one of the things that we found the most useful is having some sort of individual place for every developer. Now, the other aspect of mimicking your runtime environment is to do with the UI. By default, when you're using Debugger, it uses the WinForm client. The WinForm client is a Windows-based environment, and it will display whatever type of form you've got defined as the default for the segment. So at the segment level, I think it's a segment, it might be the model level, I can never remember, but there is an option that sort of says that the default is that you will come up in character mode or graphical screens whenever you go into Painter. And whatever that mode is set to, that is the forms that will get displayed by default by the WinForm client when you're using Debugger. So you can switch between, you know, if you've only got a character mode screen, you can display those character mode screens through the WinForm client. They're not pretty, but they do display. Or you can display the graphical screens if you've got them put in there. But it's also possible to use your own UI. And to use your own UI, you need to do a few other things. You need to use your own UI. We will come in via Rattle. So we need to start our own Rattle. And the way you do that is, again, using the options within inside Visual Studio and configuration as to which application to start. So you can see up here, I'm telling it to start the Rattle socket, and that will cause it to listen or start a Rattle listener that I can then come in and essentially connect to with using my own UI. You can specify command line arguments. The way I set this one up, I didn't need to, but you can set them up, and there's an option to specify the port number if you want to. You would then need to connect to your application after starting Debugger using your component enabler. There are some things you need to be aware of, though. The segment and the alternate name, so whatever you define as the alternate name for your application in your debugger settings needs to match the segment name for Rattle to work. You also need to define a view. And as you can see here, the example I've got here, this shows me that I've got a debug database called dbg_abs sample, and I've got my system or my alternate name called sample GT. So here's my alternate name, and that equates to the system name here, and database name equates to this database name here, and then database server registration here. This is my view name, and that points to sample GT. So what I'd have to do is build the view, and then I would use my local or my normal UI to access my test environment. The other thing that I mentioned earlier was the fact that Debugger is now invoked by the action that you do. So the great thing is that if you've got bundles, you can now just right-click on them and build those bundles for use in this type of environment if you so choose. The other thing with it is it opens up possibilities for using other test tools, both from a point of view if you want to go down this route from testing against your debug environment, but you may also want to consider the same thing for your generated environments as well. And the idea being here is if you want to use some tools like Selenium, which is a standard web form-based testing tool, so an ASP type environment, what you would do is if you use the standard ASP.NET generator, that would create you an ASP.NET environment ready to go against your debug system or even potentially your runtime system, and then you could put Selenium in front of that. Now, part of the reason for introducing this idea is that the other aspect of this is we've got our own test tool, and that's called ATT. And ATT allows us to create tests, but to use it, you need to use one of the standard UIs. Now, you can use the WinForm client if you want to, and it's possible to configure that to use with ATT. Alternatively, if you've got your own UI or you create something like the ASP.NET client, you can set that up and configure it to use ATT as well. And what this would allow you to do is you can get your developers to create the test scripts. So they write the code, they create the test scripts, they test the test scripts. And if everything's okay with them in Debugger, they can effectively release those test scripts as part of the process of releasing the code. So that means that there is the potential then that after you've done a build, you can run those same test scripts, but now against the runtime environment and see if that then passes that particular test. Now, you have to be careful with this because potentially the data is going to be different in both places. So you may want to create the tests in a way that essentially self-populate them, put the data in, then test against it. Or you may just be able to keep the two in sync using cloning databases or bringing databases from the MCP platform, possibly using something like the Ssis Generator. So there's a number of potential options here based upon that idea of using your own UI. But as I say, ATT is a potentially very useful tool, and it can be integrated in the full DevOps process. And that's one of the things that my colleague's going to cover in the next presentation anyway. Couple more topics I was going to cover. The first of those is, well, in fact, I think this is saying that this is the last topic, is performance. And the product, Unisys has been trying to improve the performance of Debugger virtually every release. So there's been a number of changes that have come over the years. Some of them I've already talked about, so things like the array handling, and that has significantly helped some particular clients where they're making use of large arrays, and it's had quite a noticeable impact. But there's other changes that are going on there. And again, there was an article as part of the field test for 7.0 where some of those were discussed and views of what the impact of those changes was. And that's in the Developing Agility October 28 edition. But you can also help yourself. So some of the things you can do is there's the capability of using edit and continue. Now, we've talked about that, and that's a big potential benefit of using AB Suite Debugger over EAE. But there may be times when you don't need to use it. For example, if you're just doing, automated testing, you don't really need this because you're not looking to stop anywhere. You just want it to go through and see if you get the right result. So this has been available for a little while, but it was always done through a registry. Now in 7.0, if you go into Tools, Options, under System Modeler, there's a debugging and there's an option to turn off or enable the edit and continue. If you disable it, that will give you a performance boost of the debugger. You can still step through your code. You just can't change it and then continue. It won't let you do it. You'd have to stop debugger and then make the change later. The other aspect here is, we've given you this capability that we put in 7 to run to breakpoint. So you don't have to wait and find the first executable line and then step over it. So it's not a major issue, but it does help. The other thing is the watch windows. They have to be updated. So the more you have in those watch windows, and again, unlike EAE, every time you start Debugger, it remembers what's in the watch window. So if you've got 200 items in the watch window, it's going to try and watch all of those 200 items every time you start Debugger. So if you can, limit which watch windows are displayed and how much is being displayed, because every time you step through, it has to update every single value in there or check every single value, and that in itself will slow down the debugging process. And it's, as it says there, it's one of the reasons we don't show arrays of strings anymore, because we knew that was causing a big performance hit. The other thing you can do is you can improve the initial debug startup time. Now, when you start Debugger for the very first time, I've already mentioned this, it generates a bunch of wrappers, and those wrappers take time to be built. So one of the things I would always advise you to do is don't make the reports deployable at the top level, at the segment level. So above the segment, you create a deployment folder, and in there you would say what objects you want to be able to deploy. So normally you would say the application components and the database. If you say reports, when you start Debugger for the first time, it will build a wrapper for every single report. And whilst individual wrappers don't take very long, if you've got 1,000 reports, it's going to take 20 minutes to build all of those wrappers the very first time you use it. If, on the other hand, you uncheck that option and say deploy reports is false, and then lower down, say in the reports folder, mark that as deployable, what happens then is that when you try and debug the system, it only creates the wrappers for the system. And that is essentially, there's a wrapper for the system, there's a wrapper for each of the external libraries, and it has to go and check whether it has to reorg the database. But it doesn't build all the wrappers for the rest of the things. So therefore, the very first time, it's very quick. It's relatively quick. When you want to debug a report, you just go to the report, right-click on it, and debug, and it will build that wrapper at that point. So it will only build the wrappers for the reports that you debug, not all the other ones that maybe you're never going to debug. So this can significantly help speed up the startup time of Debugger. So just be aware of that. And really, the final thing here is there's an option, as you can see here in the configuration, about reorganizing the database. And there's an option that says yes or no. And there's a second one that says allow recovery from failed reorganization. Well, if you say yes to reorganize database, the first time you start Debugger, after restarting Visual Studio, it will go and try and do a reorg. Now, for a large system, that means it has to build the database schema, compare that database schema with the current one, and work out if there's any differences. And whilst it doesn't take very long, it's going to take a few minutes. So a big system with several hundred or 1,000 plus structures is going to take a few minutes to go through. And that will then seem like a long time if you're waiting for it, but it's going to do that. And if it hasn't got anything to do, why ask it to go through that process? So after you've reorganized the database for the first time, you have to do it for the first time you use Debugger. But after you've done that, you don't need to change that unless you believe there is a change. And even then, it will still allow you to do a logical reorg if you want to. The final one there is about allow recovery from failed reorganization. Well, the reality there is that's just as a database backup. If you've got a backup from some other source, why let AB Suite do it? You might as well just use your own. And so you can say no if you want to. That's it. I do appreciate everybody's time, and I do notice that I have gone over my allotted time. I do apologise for that. But if there's any questions, we can perhaps take them relatively quickly, take a break, and let Nigel carry on.
Yes, I saw there were a lot of questions actually, and they were responded by Andy.
Okay.
Andy, do you think we should discuss about any questions that you already responded? You might be on mute, Andy.
Just realised I'm on mute. That never works. Yeah, I think most of them I've answered okay. The final question just came in about step over and the fact that it executes the line, whereas EA developer steps over the line. I'm not aware of that subtlety. I don't know if Gary's come across that or.
I thought step over did the same in EA, and I think the only real difference is how it handled insertables. I think if you stepped over an insertable, it did the whole of the insertable. So I think that's the big difference there, but I'm not aware of things.
I think Steve and Bill, we may need to take that offline and get back to you.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we have been looking at doing is we'll take all of the chat windows and all the questions, probably then just reformat them into a more sensible question with the appropriate answer, because sometimes it's not easy to pick them up in the chat window with interleaved questions and answers. But we will do that and make that available to everybody who's attended, so you will get all of those answers. And if we realise we've missed something, we'll get that corrected and answered as part of that process.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's make a 5-minute break now, and then we'll continue with Nigel's session. Gary, could you please switch on your timer?
Yeah, just try and find
it. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, what did I do with it? No. Sorry, I found it, I think. Right.